I've often received requests to create a video detailing Rocky Marciano's career. This usually results in me asking myself, what is there that hasn't been spoken of Marciano? Countless videos are documenting his reign as world heavyweight champion. We know of his untimely demise and what he meant for Brockton and the Italian community as a whole. Rocky Marciano is well documented in the boxing community and the sports community in general. Rocco Francis Marciano was born in Brockton, Massachusetts on September 1st, 1923, hence his nickname of the Brockton Blockbuster. A Rocky Marciano question that always comes up is about whether or not Rocky Marciano is the greatest heavyweight of all time. A direct answer can be complicated. Then again, what if it's not so complicated? What if Rocky Marciano fought today in 2025? When Rocky Marciano retired on April 27, 1956, he was the undisputed NYSAC, NBA, and ring world heavyweight champion. He was 32 years old with a record of 49 victories, 0 losses, and 43 of those victories came via knockout. What if he'd just taken some time off and on November 30th, 1956, he faced off against Floyd Patterson with all the titles at stake? Patterson defeated Archie Moore on this day, but Marciano beat Moore in Marciano's final fight, which was on September 21st, 1955. Marciano would have defeated Floyd Patterson, right? Patterson was a great fighter, though Marciano had the type of relentlessness that would make one assume he'd eventually catch Patterson. Would that have changed anything to your mind surrounding his legacy? I could go on, but it's mostly a what-if scenario regarding potential matchups. This, of course, is fun to ponder, but ultimately it won't provide a definitive resolution for all. Marciano's career spanned from 1947 to 1955. That's 8 years, which isn't a very long career for a fighter of his status and legend. That said, it generally comes down to what you do during that period. Countless fighters have runs at their peak, which lasts for a short period, but during that brief period, they are the best in their division and one of the top fighters in boxing, period. As an example, let's use someone such as Mike Tyson. He became the youngest to win the World Heavyweight Championship when he defeated Trevor Berbick on November 22nd, 1986, with the WBC World Heavyweight title on the line. From there, Tyson would be on a run of about 4 years and seemed invincible until he wasn't. On the other hand, Archie Moore had a very long career, and you could argue he peaked when he was both young and old. Now, Rocky Marciano doesn't have that same longevity of an Archie Moore, nor does he have the overall peak of a Mike Tyson from a mainstream perspective. Marciano was consistent and dominant throughout his 8-year span. He defended his title 7 times in roughly a 3-year span, certainly on par or better than some of the champions of today. Now, I'm going to essentially boil Marciano's career down to 4 opponents. These are genuinely the fighters that mattered most and contextually defined his career. That's no slight to the other opponents on Marciano's resume, as they were top-level contenders and would likely contend in any era. Before we jump into it, do me a favor and give us a thumbs up and subscribe to 86 Boxing. Turn on your notifications for more boxing content centered on boxing history. Joe Louis may be the greatest heavyweight of all time. I rank him second behind Muhammad Ali, but Louis being number 1 isn't a stretch. Louis was supremely talented and had a high boxing IQ. He knew how to set up his punches, and his short hooks were a thing of beauty. Many saw the canvas when facing Louis, as he is one of the most devastating punchers in boxing history. Louis owns the record for most consecutive world heavyweight title defenses, a title he won on June 22nd, 1937, when he knocked out the Cinderella Man and defending champion James J. Braddock. With 25 defenses, it's hard to see anyone breaking Louis's title record, even in a 4-belt era as we are in today. Larry Holmes, Muhammad Ali, and Vladimir Klitschko have come close, but they are still 5 or more behind Louis. To say the least, Louis was a bad dude. On October 26, 1951, Marciano knocked Joe Louis out and out of the ring in the 8th round. This sent shockwaves around the sport. mainly because for Lewis, it was a sight never seen. The consensus #1 heavyweight for a decade, Lewis couldn't deal with the youth, conditioning, and punch of Marciano. It was a fairly sad ending for many, especially those who saw Lewis at his peak. Now, Lewis was 37, and if you've reached that age, you understand what it feels like. Marciano was 27. Lewis was on an 8-fight win streak before meeting Marciano, but there are certainly levels. The key takeaway is that Marciano did what he was supposed to do. Even to this day, if you put a fighter in their prime in the ring with a more experienced veteran on the back end of their career, the younger, fresher fighter should go directly at the veteran and show why youth matters in the sweet science. What Marciano did was execute in the manner one would expect from an elite fighter in or around their prime. Given such, this can't be held against Marciano. If you're still in the boxing game and agree to take on younger pros of the caliber of Marciano, you should expect that it will be a tough night out. Lewis found out the hard way. Marciano was at his peak and laced one of the best in history. Joe Louis would not fight again officially. Lewis remained an icon throughout his life, though he went through hard times. Lewis had a career record of 66 victories, 3 losses, and 52 of those victories came via knockout. Jersey Joe Walcott has a somewhat deceiving record at face value. Walcott had a career record of 49 victories, 20 losses, and 1 draw. 31 of his victories came via knockout. Those 20 losses, I'm sure you're questioning. They came by facing the best competition during his era. Check out his resume for yourself. Walcott had one of the most unique styles in history, as was his footwork and the way he would pivot in almost a gliding motion. He's also an example of how experience matters. When Jersey Joe Walcott stepped in the ring with Rocky Marciano on May 15, 1953, he probably didn't suspect that he'd be on the wrong end of one of the most iconic moments and photos in the history of boxing. After all, Walcott had been in with several of the best heavyweights available. Walcott failed in 2 bids for the world heavyweight title against Joe Louis in 1947 and 1948. He also failed in his first 2 attempts to pry the title from the hands of the Cincinnati Cobra Ezzard Charles before overcoming the hump on July 18, 1951, knocking out Charles in the 7th of 15 rounds. Now, Jersey Joe would defend the title against Charles in his next fight in 1952. That led to 2 matchups with Rocky Marciano, with the first being on September 23, 1952. Walcott had success and was actually winning the fight, but in the 13th round, Marciano landed Susie Q, and it led to the most iconic photo and picture in the history of boxing. Marciano would knock out Walcott in the return bout on May 15, 1953. Like Louis, this was Walcott's last official match. The first fight with Walcott showed that Marciano possessed something you can't teach. Intangibles that are just apparent in an individual from birth and development. There's this thing called heart, and in the context of boxing, heart has allowed some of the greats to overcome the impossible. There's no blueprint, you just have to be placed in a situation that forces it out of you. Then you have to find a way, which is what Marciano did on countless occasions. He found a way. Now hear me out. The Cincinnati Cobra Ezzard Charles may very well be the most underrated boxer in history. Seriously. He had a career record of 95 victories, 25 losses, and 1 draw. 52 of his victories came via knockout. Starting out at middleweight, Charles rose through the ranks and eventually settled at heavyweight. Charles was a member of Black Murderers Row early in his career, a contingent of black fighters who never got a shot at a world title despite being the highest-ranked boxers within their division, primarily attributed to the color line and champions' refusal to defend their title against a black fighter. A middleweight title shot wasn't achievable, but Charles fought some of the best ever in his middleweight run. This didn't stop Ezzard Charles from rising the ranks. He moved from middleweight to light heavyweight and dominated, but never got a title shot there. Look up fighters such as Jimmy Bivens, Charlie Burley, and Lloyd Marshall to get an understanding of the types of opponents that he was facing, often multiple times at that. Charles would move up to settle at heavyweight as there was more money to be made in the Supreme Division. On June 22nd, 1949, Charles defeated Jersey Joe Walcott to become the new world heavyweight champion. Charles would go on to defend the title 9 times before dropping the title to Jersey Joe Walcott in 1951. He'd also lose in the trilogy bout with Walcott in 1952. Charles remained patient, and in 1952 he would get another opportunity at the title in 2 fights against Rocky Marciano. Despite his gameness and success, Charles dropped a decision on June 17th before being knocked out on September 17th. In one of those fights, Marciano actually had his nose split but fought through to show the type of toughness and conditioning he possessed. Charles would eventually get back to his winning ways but was unable to put himself in a position to fight for the title for the remainder of his career. Now, in defeating Ezzard Charles, Marciano defeated a fighter whose overall talent and ability can't be singularly summed. I challenge all of you to check out a video on Ezzard Charles. Read about him, do some research, and you'll understand the magnitude of this great fighter. The old mongoose Archie Moore is one of the 10 greatest fighters to ever live, no question. He was one of the more devastating punchers who could get his opponents out at any point in a fight and had one of the toughest careers one could fathom. He finished his career with a record of 186 victories, 23 losses, 10 draws. 142 victories came via knockout. He also had 1 no contest. Moore was a true road warrior and often had to travel to get opportunities, even if that meant he was on the short end of the finances. He, like Charles, fought a number of the Black Murderers Row fighters multiple times. Moore was as tough as they come and is the greatest older fighter in the history of the sport. Moore used a guard similar to the Philly Shell and knew every trick of the trade, and his peers would acknowledge such. Moore was one of the craftiest fighters ever and probably forgot more than a typical fighter ever learns. On November 17, 1952, Moore would win the World Light Heavyweight title by unanimously defeating Joey Maxim in 15 rounds. Moore was 36 at the time, and all of the long sacrifices were worth it. He would do the same in their rematch. Moore would get a shot at the World Heavyweight title on September 21, 1955, against none other than Rocky Marciano. Moore floored Marciano in the first, but would be dropped multiple times himself from there before being stopped in the 9th round of the contest. Amazingly, this wasn't the last stop for Moore, as he would bounce back, even again going down an amazing run with the World Light Heavyweight title, including a classic fight in 1959 where, after overcoming 3 knockdowns in the first round, he'd come back to stop Yvonne Durrell. Archie Moore needs no justification. If you understand boxing, then you understand his greatness. Now, what does all of this mean for Rocky Marciano? Rocky Marciano is one of the greatest heavyweights in history. Arguments have and can be made that he wasn't in one of the deeper eras of the heavyweight division, which is fair. That being said, he was in the era he was destined to be in, and when it came to competition, he faced all of the best heavyweights available. He defended his title multiple times, and despite it looking like he was going out with an L at times, he found a way to win. In boxing, the victory remains supreme. I don't mean that from a record standpoint, because despite the fact that Marciano was 49-0, it ultimately comes down to who he or any other fighter for that matter was in the ring with. In the case of Marciano, his record in competition trumps many title holders who's gained the title in the multi-belt era. Additionally, Marciano didn't duck the opportunity to face a Joe Louis, Ezzard Charles, Jersey Joe Walcott, or Archie Moore. This speaks volume as to the character of the man and fighter. Despite age, race, color, or creed, Marciano was willing to fight. Where Marciano ranks in the pantheons of heavyweights is very much subjective. Some view him as the greatest ever, some view him as one of the 10 greatest ever, and some don't rate him as highly as others. Realistically speaking, it doesn't matter because he has multiple victories over many of the elite boxers of his era. Some will look at his size and use that as a reason as to why he wouldn't be successful in other eras, even here in modern times. By that same token, what would a modern heavyweight do in the times of Rocky Marciano? The gloves would be different, the total number of rounds would be different, the activity would be different, and of course, the training would be different. We have a number of huge heavyweights today who pose a size challenge for Marciano, but could they stop him? Would they be able to keep up with the conditioning of Marciano, who was one of the hardest trainers? It's hard to say. What I will say is that Joe Louis, Jersey Joe Walcott, Ezzard Charles, and Archie Moore were better in their time than any active heavyweight, and I have no doubt they'd be willing to take on all challengers, as is the case with Rocky Marciano. There's no definitive answer as to who is the greatest of all time, and the same goes for the greatest heavyweight of all time. That said, it takes something beyond the physical to deal with and defeat a guy like Rocky Marciano. He refused to be broken, and it would take something or someone with a similar mentality to overcome his tenacity. Marciano was 5'10 and a half with a 68-inch reach, so he was often going to be the smaller guy in the ring. As the great John L. Sullivan once stated, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Where do you rate Rocky Marciano? How would he do with some of the heavyweights of today or those in the past we didn't get to see? Be sure to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.